We're about to begin our second session under the moderation of Zoe Strother. So I'm handing proceedings now over to Professor Strother.
Okay, so welcome to the afternoon session. In the morning, Bénédicte Savoy asked about what about the United States? And although there have been many small conversations across the country, on and off camera, we really felt that the university was the place to initiate a substantive discussion and analysis of the issue from as many points of view as possible. So that means also including those of you in the audience. We're so delighted with how many of you have traveled from across the country to be here. And so to encourage that, I again emphasize that we will be recording the talks, but we will not be recording the discussion. The cameras will be turned off, so you should feel free to speak. Any endeavor like this, involves the contributions of many, many people. And we thank the Academy for providing their incredible expertise and the accommodations we enjoy. So I really going beyond the pale. So I really want to call out Barbara Fida, Allison Jeffrey, Abigail Asher, Baron Preston, and their teams for making this happen. And also, it would not have happened without a substantive gift from the Mellon Foundation. And so Alison Gilchrist and her team at that time, we really applaud you and your vision in this matter. And also the Art History Department at Columbia, the Art History Department at Barnard, the Maison Française. And I also want to thank Francesco Polizzi and Ashley Durkoop for making pivotal suggestions that helped make this all happen. So we are going to begin the first part of the afternoon session with Ciraj Rassool, who is Professor of History at the University of the Western Cape and Director of the African Program in Museum and Heritage Studies in Cape Town, South Africa. He was involved with the repatriation of remains of Claes and Troy Pienaar and is a leading figure in heritage and repatriation issues. So please join me in welcoming Professor Rassool.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Zoe. I need to thank Zoe and all the colleagues and institutions and funders here who have brought us together, who've made these conversations possible. As I start, I also want to thank Patrick Mudekereza, who, as some people will know, did not get his visa to come to this meeting. And as a result, we have lost his voice for today. And it's also necessary for me to announce that early this morning I discovered that one of our comrades in New York, the South African exile who headed up the American Committee on Africa, perhaps the leading anti-apartheid strategizing body, the South African exile, Jennifer Davis, passed away. And we need to remember her. It's been very interesting as a South African and as an African scholar to have been present in Germany during recent processes of the intensification of museum debates in Germany, in the German-speaking world, and to be, in a sense, outside of one's Anglophone comfort box and outside of the assumptions that one makes about disciplines, about museum structures, about how collections are organized, and to be amidst all manner of argument about the West and the non-European, as our German colleagues often talk, in quite an kind of unreconstructed language. And of course, as many people here will know, I've been, over many years, I've been doing work on rethinking the museum, what the museum can be, what some of us call the museum of process. Something then got taken up in a wonderful book put together by our colleague Ray Silverman, about rethinking the museum beyond its modern, old ICOM form of the care of collections. And some of you will have followed some of those debates where the specter of transformation was felt to perhaps come to ICOM, but as was shown, the rear guard of ICOM as a kind of colonial holding institution fought back, and the new definition of the museum was not approved, and instead that debate has been postponed. But having said that, in UNESCO in 2012, in a program that started with the energies of favela museums in Brazil and other museums in Latin America, culminating, that was in 2012, culminating in a statement that was published in 2016, UNESCO produced a set of recommendations about museums that fundamentally began to question the old definition. Because let us not beat around the bush here. We are talking about the fundamental reconstitution of what we mean by museum. And this debate about restitution and repatriation and return is one element, a vital element of that process in which we, our generation, is witness to that transformation. Of course, in South Africa, some of the work that we've been doing in the laboratory of how you make a new democracy after apartheid has been involved in the project of reconstituting and reorienting the ethnographic museum, in which the ethnographic museum is not a museological form of a post-apartheid society. And so in Cape Town, in the main National Museum, the ethnographic museum has been recast, and its ethnographic history of its collections has been retold and re-narrativized as the ongoing work happens in the stores of uniting previously segregated collections in terms of the colonial classificatory division, one which would not be tenable in a democratizing society. Of course, there are no easy victories here. This is the epistemic work that has to take place and manifest itself in the everyday collections management work. But of course, the new collections division at Iziko National Museum in South Africa reframed that collection space as social history. And it's very interesting how the History Museum has been the museum form of remaking a new society. And I think there are developments in the United States as well. And when you look at the new museums on the Mall, these new museums are very much about reconstituting people's experience as historical. So the ethnographic, as the discipline of colonial reason of subject people, and the governing of people and objects in a complex society, marked by multiple, sequential, simultaneous colonialisms, of being both a colonized society, but also being a colonizing society. And that makes the laboratory of South African museum formation and the question of restitution so interesting, when South Africa is both colonized and colonizer. I've only recently understood, because of being in Germany, how radical it was to have been formed intellectually in the field of African history. In the 1980s, in the United States, in South Africa, and by extension in Britain, in the discipline of African independence and agency, in all of its complexity, but always as a critique of and in a never-ending dialogue with a transforming anthropology that was always trying to reinvent itself outside its colonial origins. Now, I had written a book 20 years ago about human remains collecting from South Africa, human remains that had ended up in South African and Austrian museums, that gave rise in 2012 to the restitution and reburial of the remains of Klaas and Troy Pienaar in Kuruman, in the Northern Cape, in 2012, in which I was privileged to be a part of and being inside the negotiations and the strategizing and the development of a methodology of restitution, of repatriation, referred to as rehumanization. Let me just take an aside here and talk about those two concepts, because it has come up as one of the challenges of our discussion. And in our conversations with our Canadian colleagues, in the partnership between my university and the University of Toronto, it's been very interesting how the use of the idea of restitution is deemed not to be appropriate in the Canadian setting because it refers to something else. In our discussions, the idea of repatriation is found to be far too bound within the nation, bound within the national narrative and in the National Museum. And not only that, but also bound in a very gendered way in the nation. And so the idea of restitution in these times of truth and reconciliation and land restitution and in a sense of restoration has been a term that has emerged far more prominently in our discussions. But of course, those terms, the use of those terms should never be a point of arrival, because those are particular politics of return. These are not just choices, they are politics. And the methodology that we ended up arguing for in the process of the return of Klaas and Troy Pienaar was one of rehumanization. The idea that it is possible to identify the dead because of the nature of the South African archive at the time of the theft of remains from graves by European anthropologists at a time when South Africa was becoming a nation and was going through its own process of scientization, laying claim to a process of nationing that some of us have referred to as the South Africanization of science. South Africa passed its heritage law that sought to regulate not just the trafficking in rock engravings and rock art, but that sought to regulate the traffic in the dead. And it's because of the quality of that archive, it has been possible for us to put names and biographies to some of the remains that ended up in European and South African museums. In South Africa, we're at a stage of being 85 to 90% of the way through a national policy, with, I am told, the South African state, once the policy is formed, ready to put budgets to objectives of the return of human remains and cultural artifacts. A number of things have become clear about just how integrated collecting histories were, how integrated disciplines were, and how human remains, cultural artifacts, sound recordings were collected and made by the very same scholars, and how these were later artificially divided into different disciplines and collecting institutions. And so when I was in a meeting recently about the history of the phonogram archive and the sound archive in Berlin, and you look at the record of all the people who made field sound recordings, they were the very same people who collected human remains that ended up in the Lushan collection in Berlin. And I and others have recently started making an argument that the stolen rock engravings that were transported on the same ox wagon as the remains of Klaas and Troy Pienaar and others who we can name, such as Ko, Kruisband, Masebi, should also be understood as ancestors, as human remains, as objects with spirit, as was said earlier, in which objects can be thought of as persons with vital force. And with this experience of the South African methodology, we were brought into engagements with processes of human remains restitution from Berlin to Namibia. And to think about the historical tragedy of the ethnic framings of Namibian restitution politics. Because one of the dangers that we have with restitution is not entering into the colonial categories in which remains and objects were collected. Now, this has happened at a time of increasing pressure within Germany by post-colonial activists demanding attention be given to Germany's colonial past. A lot of this pressure and debate has concerned the futility of remaking an ethnographic museum in a recreated Prussian castle, as if it is possible to return to a seemingly more glorious 19th century and somehow avoid the violence and ravages of German 20th century history. The Humboldt Forum is part of Germany's reinventions of itself as a Western nation, holding on to that utterly distasteful category of a non-European museum for people to inhabit the non in the negative. Of course, we know the lessons of Black consciousness and what the critique of the negative is. One has to admit that there has been tremendous movement from just 4 or 5 years ago, when in a famous meeting in Bonn, one of the founding leaders of the Humboldt Forum famously declared that Germans were so fortunate that their colonial experience was so short, and as a consequence of which Germany was relatively untouched by colonialism, by colonial attitudes. 4 years ago, in the work of the advisory board of the Van Lushan collection of human remains, there had been tremendous reluctance to embrace restitution as a basic acceptance. There's now been a basic acceptance in 4 years that human remains claimed for will be returned, and even a more proactive policy that is now preparing East African remains, largely from Rwanda, to be returned. There's been a lot of progress with policies, new committees and desks, new codes, new policies. These happen almost every day. And of course, the process unleashed by Savoy and Sarr has contributed substantially to this pressure. Nevertheless, our German colleagues tend to talk about, and this is the name of one of the new committees, art and collections from colonial contexts, as if colonialism is something that is firmly in the past. That was the subject of a very important exhibition in the German Historical Museum a few years ago, but it was a colonialism that was in the past. It was colonialism as a subject of study, as something empirical, as part of provenance research to be attended to through museum collections management. Now, colonialism is that, of course, but it is far more than that. Importantly, as is brought out in the report, colonialism is epistemic, and there are disciplinary elements to this that take on a very peculiar nature in Germany, where all this concept that we have of disciplines being the same all over the world and of a holus bolus concept of the West has been fundamentally questioned, where one thinks about what the field of African studies or Afrikanistik is in Germany, of ethnologie with Sprachkunde, without any sense of African history. Now, this is the peculiar phenomenon of the debate about colonial legacies in Germany, is that this is a debate, this is an anthropology that has taken place in a society that never faced liberation movements. And that has left very peculiar disciplinary formation of 19th century disciplines, largely untouched, in which African studies is done in certain ways as if those are the natural ways of disciplines for certain societies. And the same goes for museums. And so, yes, restitution is a vitally important aspect of decolonization. And that is one of the main, if not the main argument of Berlin postcolonial and these other formations. But in addition to that, perhaps even more importantly, we have to do the epistemic work that accompanies restitution. We have to attend to the meaning of the artifact, and we have to make sure that the artifacts are not separated from the human remains. So, in fact, what we are witnessing now is a period in which we need to inaugurate perhaps something that we can call the post-ethnographic, and to ponder what that critique will be. You have some of possibilities of what that could be from the work of Clementine de Lis at Weltkulturen Museum from a few years ago, and there are other possibilities. What we know is that restitution is not an event that will occur, not a series of events. Unfortunately, our Namibian colleagues, led by the state, Namibian state, have understood restitution to take place through events management that governments do very well. And once the returns have happened, the restitution process came to an end. And what we need in this debate, in order for it to be rescued from the possibility being one of assuaging European consciences, from it not merely being a means of placing European museums on a more ethical footing, we need to be able to enhance the capacities of African claims making. Because apart from some examples here and there, Benin Dialogue Forum, Ethiopia, and some examples from West Africa, in general, the institutions of African Museum cooperation and the continental projects that we have of creating a unified African voice in museums has been substantially weakened in an international cultural economy in which African museums remain trapped in relations of dependency. And we need to think about and be able to resource the ability of African museums and African activists to come together and to make the claims, to be able to work with governments in order to be able to mount claims, so that the process of restitution that we will inaugurate as the basis of the new museum in the future, because it is going to be with us for a long time, that it has to be rooted on energies from the African continent itself. And we need that because we are divided by colonial histories, we are divided by different museum histories, we are divided by language, and we need a greater sense of integration of African approaches to these questions. And as we know, there are legal obstacles, but all of those can be overcome. What we need is greater preparedness. We need greater African preparedness, and that needs to be at the center of our restitution politics. Thank you.
Thank you, Ciraj. For the afternoon sessions, we'll be grouping the questions for the end of the panel, and when we have a generous period allotted for discussion. So now we are going to hear from Erica Jones, who's Associate Curator of African Arts at the Fowler Museum at the University of California, Los Angeles. And many people don't realize that the Fowler has one of the largest African art collections in the United States. And Dr. Jones's pioneering dissertation at UCLA, supervised by Stephen Nelson, was on the history of museums in the Cameroon grass fields. But since joining the Fowler in 2015, she has been in Exhibition Dynamo, most recently curating on display in the walled city, the Nigerian Pavilion at the British Empire Exhibition, 1924 to 25.
The longest exhibition title ever, potentially. I'm aware. I wanted to thank Bachir Diagne and also Zoe Struther for inviting me, and thank you to the Italian Academy for hosting us today. This is quite lovely. I kind of wanted to say now for something completely different, but after hearing Ciraj speak, you know, this is, I'll be examining a single case study, and this really is about relationships of dependency to a certain degree, and thinking about financial dependency and infrastructure, and all kinds of challenges and opportunities that museums in specifically the grass fields of Cameroon are facing. So I'm going to dive right in. Museums in the grassfields region of Cameroon tend to be small palace museums for the most part. They are located on palace grounds and run by palace-selected curators and caretakers. I'm also going to start with a map because one time someone asked me if Cameroon was in Southeast Asia, and ever since then, we always have a map. So palaces in the museums in the grass field, this is a trend that goes back to the 1920s with the founding of the Palace Museum in Fumban. When looking at these small institutions through the lens of audience and funding, there are many fascinating stories to tell, revealing a great deal about the shifting politics of each kingdom. I've just told you that, and yet, rather than focus on these localized stories in this paper, I will address the now defunct Bamenda Provincial Museum, which was founded to represent the arts of the entire Northwest region, therefore constituting a relatively singular venture within this region's 100-ish year-long museum history. And I just want to point out the grass fields. We're looking at this region right over here, and Bamenda as the center of the Anglophone portion. The Bamenda Provincial Museum existed for just 35 years, from 1959 to 1994. And in that time, the ebb and flow of funding and personnel, as well as the changing approaches to display and collecting, speak to a cultural space that represents its region's overall experience regarding access, support, and status with relation to the central government. Furthermore, the history of the institution is indicative of the broader Cameroonian engagement with the arts since independence, the outsized impact of individual government officials, the fickle nature of NGO funding, and the position of the Anglophone region in relation to the Francophone majority in the country. The idea of building a museum in the city of Bamenda, the most populous and accessible city in the art-producing region of the Anglophone grassfields, began with a colonial administrator, M.D.W. Jeffries, who in 1936 made an initial donation of geological and ethnographic objects to the colonial administration in the hopes of starting a museum project. This collection is lost and nowhere to be found, but the idea remained, and in 1959, Robert Dick Reed, at the behest of Bernard Fagg, who was then the director of antiquities for the Nigerian government, opened the Provincial Museum in Bamenda. The museum was housed in the back room of the community center on Commercial Avenue, the main thoroughfare at the center of town. And so you'll see the museum is this back room. Dick Reed built a collection in around 4 months from the holdings of local kings. He claimed that he didn't want to strip bare the royal storerooms, but in his book, Sanamu, Adventures in the Search of African Art, he proudly recounts that he negotiated tirelessly for the objects he wanted. He viewed this project as an effort to preserve the local heritage for future generations, clearly implying that he viewed the kingdoms as unequal to this task. But Dick Reed was not an expert in the arts of the Grassfields region. Consequently, as anthropologist Alice Horner has commented, his museum struck an odd note. There are conspicuous lacunas in the collection, as works from major carving centers of Oku, Kom, and Nso are entirely missing from the collection. Also, his installation was a bizarre fantasy home interior that integrated works from a variety of kingdoms without the slightest attempt to show the differences between their cultural or artistic traditions. And I'm sorry, there was no key to figure out actually which section represented which part of the home. The initial layout of the museum resulted in a narrative of Grassfields art that was, as Horner notes quite succinctly, it was ahistorical and generalized. From the records that I've seen in the Bamenda branch of the Ministry of Arts and Culture archives, little changed in the first decade after the museum was founded. In the years immediately following the tenure of Robert Dick Reed, the museum, as a remnant of the end of the colonial era, seemed to be on a path to increasing stagnation. Yet the course of the institution changed in the early 1970s as a result of the intercession of one powerful government figure, Vice President Souleymane Bachir, who sought out a new slate of museum patrons and gave it a clear regional purpose to go along with a constant stream of financial support. As a result of a request made by Vice President Muna to the U.S. Peace Corps, 2 volunteers were sent to Bamenda. Volunteers Craig and Mary Kinzelman took over the day-to-day operations of the museum from 1971 to 1974 with the support of a local staff, key among them Mr. Martin Asongwed. It was during these 3 years of the Kinzelman's tenure that the museum collection came to more inclusively present the breadth and depth of artistic production in the Anglophone Grassfields. And among the many changes, most importantly, was the exhibition design that we see here on the screen. As during this time, Roy Sieber was hired to consult, and he designed the thematically driven layout that remained until the museum's close. The Kinzelmans cataloged the entire collection, something which had never been done, and with funding from Cameroonian and American sources, expanded the collection to include works from previously underrepresented kingdoms as well as objects from everyday life. And here we have the interior of the museum as it looked until it closed in '94. Paul and Clara Gebauer, well-known missionaries who spent decades in the northwest region of Cameroon, donated to the collection. Kings and community members continued to sell objects to the museum, and it became a meeting place for scholars working in the region who helped the staff research the accumulating objects. All of this is reflected in the card catalog that the Kinzelmans started. A part of this card catalog, an incredibly important source of information, remains in the archives of the Ministry of Arts and Culture today. It's an education in the arts of the Northwest region. By the time that the museum closed, it had an impressive range of objects, each with detailed descriptions of who made what, when, and how an item was used and in what context. These are very, very densely written cards, I will say. The catalog serves as a repository of knowledge from some of the anthropologists and art historians working in the grassfields at the time, notably Roy Sieber, Igor Kopytov, Paul Gebauer, Jean-Pierre Varnier, but more importantly, records the knowledge of local members of the Bamenda surrounding area who had used or inherited the objects that they subsequently sold to the museums, or to the museum. The 3-year period when the Kinzelmans worked at the museum highlights some of the trends we tend to find with government and aid-based patronage for museums in this region. And I'm just giving you another view of the interior here. Souleymane Bachir was an incredibly important Anglophone figure in the central government. While he acted as a powerful advocate for the Northwest region, Alice Horner, again, she was very eloquent on this topic, has pointed out that he was, quote, too well associated with the central government to be accused of regionalism, end quote. And I thought that was a really fine way of putting how Muna was able to navigate these sort of complex political situations between the Anglophone and Francophone communities in Cameroon. Among his many interests, Muna was an avid collector of grassfields art, and it's entirely due to his interest in the arts and his placement within the government that he was able to approach the Peace Corps to request their assistance with the museum. With the joint support of the central government and the Peace Corps, the museum took on a new role in the region, becoming an important stopping point for scholars, tourists, and dignitaries. Dignitaries acknowledged the politically advantageous nature of the museum. Due to participation of so many local kingdoms in the formation of the collection, diplomats were able to show support for the region by visiting the museum without showing the preferential treatment that would be associated with visiting specific palaces. The importance of this role for the region really can't be overstated. In recent years and prior to the current unrest that we heard a bit about this morning, and given the poor quality of the roads in the Northwest, dignitaries today tend to visit only the most accessible palace museums, which has concentrated visibility and funds in certain kingdoms, much to the frustration and growing animosity of other local kingdoms. After the Kinzelmans left and until its closure in 1994, the museum was run exclusively by local staff, all under the guidance of Mr. Francis Ndomokong. Through the 1980s and after Muna's tenure, Ndomokong and his staff still received some governmental financial support, and they continued to grow the collection, making collecting trips throughout the Northwest. Not only did curators record the uses of the objects they purchased, but also the reasons for sale. And some individuals parted with the art because they had modern objects that made them obsolete. Sometimes they needed money to build a new roof for their home, in one specific case. In another specific case, a man had received a new title and with it a new stool, and so he sold his former stool to the museum. In another instance, a boy came to the museum and sold 4 carved cow horn drinking cups to the curator. The next day, the boy came back and stated that his family was incredibly angry with him for having sold the cups, and he needed 1 back to appease them. So, in the end, the museum had 3. According to the former museum archivist, Margaret Nyunga Timney, collecting had largely stopped by the early 1990s. So while funds for the museum were already shrinking, its closure can be largely attributed to the fickle nature of NGO funding. For 30 years, the museum had resided on city council land in a shared use building while being operated by a national agency, as if that's not a tricky situation. Adjacent to the museum was the library, as we see here. And in the early 1990s, the British Library Council came to Bamenda to do a 3-day training with librarians. As a result of this training, the British Library Council decided to offer 10,000 books to expand the Bamenda Library's collection. The City Council accepted the donation and informed the museum that they would have to close and remove all objects to make room for the books. And speaking with Mr. Tazung, the president of the City Council at the time, he claims that the council polled people in Bamenda and asked them whether they'd rather have a museum or a library. You get one, not both. An overwhelming 80% said that they wanted a library. Mrs. Nyonga Timni, again, the museum archivist, said that she didn't really recall any poll, but what she recalls is a period of confusion when the museum personnel were plainly informed that they had to get everything out immediately, and the staff was all reassigned. She points out that the building was on council land, and it was entirely that body's prerogative to use the building as they thought would best serve the community. And to that question, when I asked people who grew up in Bamenda if they had ever visited the museum, overwhelmingly people had never heard of it, people who had lived there their whole lives. And museum records do indicate that hundreds of local school children attended every year. But the people who I spoke to who did recall the museum saw it as a place for tourists, for researchers, for dignitaries, and not really for the local community. The closure of the museum was part of a diminishing interest in the cultural patrimony of the country that was also going on at a national level in terms of funding. So records show that during the 1970s and 80s, government officials made considerable attempts to enforce strict policies regarding the export of antiquities. Here we have an example of one of these certificates of non-antiquity that all visitors were required to have if they were taking things out of the country. As of 2013, employees at the Ministry of Arts and Culture in Bamenda had never heard of a certificate of non-antiquity. This was no longer issued. When the museum was open, it was common knowledge that you had to stop there before leaving to receive your certificate, and actually many objects, according to the card catalog in the museum, were confiscated as people brought them in to be certified, and were told, oh, no, that's an antiquity, you're leaving that with us. And so this was a really, quite central part of the museum's mandate. Another part, the museum had also been integral in helping to resolve local police issues that involved art objects. In one case, and I have an example here on the screen of one example, and another that was related in the card catalog, the Prince's Takumbam Society of and.Zoe attempted to gain local status by creating a series of masks that gave them enough power to challenge the role of the local regulatory society, the Kwifon, and I'm giving you some broad strokes of this story here. And the Kwifon, who are really broadly seen as the kingmakers in the community. The Kwifon appealed to the government district officer, who ruled that no society should be more powerful than the Kwifon, and that allowing the Takumbam Society to keep these masks would tear the community apart. As a solution, the masks were confiscated and given to the museum instead. The card also indicates that something was being done to curtail the illegal trade in antiquities with the help of the museum. 4 object records indicate their source as the Fawn of Bemessing through the divisional officer of Bamenda. The story is that in 1960, the Fawn of Bemessing traded the 4 items to American anthropologist Mr. Diamond in exchange for his car. And Mr. Diamond was stopped at the Nigerian border where the items were confiscated. As a supplemental note, the card indicates that this incident resulted in the King of Bemessing's dethronement by his people. The closure of the museum made trafficking art objects easier, with no one issuing permits for transport. There was also no longer a home for any confiscated objects in the region. In 1994, the objects were packed into a room next to the library and left there until 2004, when President Paul Biya came to visit Bamenda. Shortly before his arrival, the Ministry of Arts and Culture was informed that the city would need that small building for the president's visit, and they had only a few days to move everything to their ministry building across the city at Up Station. Ministry workers recalled a horribly chaotic 2 days. Objects were packed into a truck and then piled into a room. Dozens of objects were stolen, lost, and damaged in the move, not to mention the untold numbers of objects that had been stolen in the prior decade. By the time that I visited the Ministry of Arts and Culture, they no longer had the key to the room where the objects were stored, and what's more, it didn't really matter if they could find the key because renovations had been undertaken in the interim that obstructed the keyhole. There seems to be a certain amount of irony surrounding the regional museum's current status. During my research into local palace museums of the Grassfields that opened in the 2000s, I found that many people complained about the location of these palace museums. Locals conveyed that they could not and would not visit their community museums because they could never go to the palace unless invited by the king himself. This made visiting the museum, even though it was theoretically free to them, impossible. They lamented that the museums were not in a neutral location, such as Bamenda, where people could visit freely without feeling as though they needed an invitation. This sentiment makes me wonder whether the timing was wrong for the Bamenda Provincial Museum in the 90s, whether today, aside from the current political strife in the region, the institution could become a thriving part of the city. And I should say that before the current tension started, there were conversations happening in the ministry to reopen the museum in a new location, that this could again become this type of institution that it had been before. The history of this museum, from the center of town to locked in this storeroom that we see here, encapsulates transformations that arts and culture have undergone in this region specifically. The existence of the museum is indicative, first and foremost, that this region has a long-standing, thriving museum culture. You know, of the 500 museums in Africa that were cited earlier this morning, I wouldn't be surprised if more than 20 of them are located in this area alone. From the Bamenda Provincial Museum's founding to its closing, one can see how the Cameroonian government's interest in the arts has ebbed and flowed. The museum was founded in order to preserve traditional culture. You know, here we have a clear Western statement that these vibrant cultures were in need of preservation, though it is one that's still echoed by these palace museums that exist today. Then followed a period when the museum was allowed to languish, only to see a resurgence in the 70s, a period during which the government had renewed interest in the arts due to Vice President Muna, who poured money into building a national collection and ran radio programs intended to sensitize people to the importance of holding on to their arts and not allowing them to leave Cameroon. Finally, there is the current governmental approach to the arts, which is characterized by, especially again in this region specifically, a drying up of funds. And today, you know, Bamenda is at the heart of a region where violent clashes with Cameroonian military forces are ongoing, a conflict that has only recently, on September 24th, seen government soldiers attack the Bafut Palace, which is on the UNESCO tentative list of World Heritage Sites, and loot objects from the Palace Museum. And so, under the current administration, there's no place for a museum that was once a meeting place of academics, dignitaries from around the world, tourists, missionaries, researchers, and school children. But that, in my opinion, and it's just my opinion, makes it only more important for a place just as this one to exist again in hopefully the near future.
Enlightening perspective on just how complex this history can be. And now we will hear from Pap Ndiaye, who is a professor of history at the Centre d'Histoire de Sciences Po and a longtime collaborator with Columbia. As many of you know, France forbids the collection of census data on race and ethnicity of its citizens. But Professor Ndiaye has thrown a grenade into that by publishing a book in 2008 called The Black Condition, Essay on a French Minority, in which he analyzes the experience of people who come to embrace and who are certainly framed as Black in France from the 18th century to the present. It's considered one of the founding works of French Black studies. He had a long period of study at the University of Virginia, and so his work really moves between both sides of the Atlantic and is focusing on the discourse of racial discrimination in France and the US. So, thank you.
Thank you, Zoe. Good afternoon. I want to thank Zoe Strother, Bachir Diagne, and Jenny Price for the invitation to this great conference and the smooth organization. It's a great pleasure for me to be part of this superb conversation we've had since this morning. It's also an added pleasure for me to participate in conferences with African colleagues and people specialized in African studies, since these colleagues and friends don't have any difficulties pronouncing my last name. So it's always a pleasure. When the museum, the Quai Branly Museum, was inaugurated in 2006, I remember participating in a panel discussion with the head of the museum, and I raised the issue of the restitution of the thousands and thousands of artifacts looted in Africa, stored in the Quai Branly Museum. The newly appointed head of the Quai Branly answered in a very classic way. He said, Africans are not ready. Les Africains ne sont pas prêts, which is, of course, the classic colonial answer. Africans are not ready, meaning they need to be taught, they need to be educated in some ways, and they don't have the proper museums to host the objects anyway. What I want to shed light onto today is the historical depth of the issue of restitution by asking a simple question, which is not so simple at all, in fact. When did exactly the restitution surface as a political issue on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean, and more specifically in France? In other words, what is the proto-history of restitution? My argument here is that the restitution debate certainly became visible in the 1970s, but that the idea of restitution, I would even say the dream of restitution, has a longer and deeper history, which can be traced in speeches, articles, books, fragments of all kinds, oral memories that should all be studied by historians. Before the 1970s, the restitution debate was, if not central, at least floating around among intellectuals, writers, artists of the African diaspora. So what I would like to provide you in a schematic way are a few elements and some sort of a chronological framework so as to make you aware of the restitution debate in the longue durée. My purpose is to engage a discussion on the longue durée, and these are just a few elements of an ongoing research. The first moment, I think, which is absolutely crucial, is that of the interwar period, the 1920s and the 1930s. The interwar period witnessed the construction of a loosely structured African diaspora, which has been well analyzed. We know, for example, that the Harlem Renaissance cannot be analyzed in a purely American framework, but in a global perspective, highlighting the relations with imperial capitals such as London and Paris, and also the colonial world, the Caribbean and Africa. on the American side, Langston Hughes, Claude McKay, Alan Locke, W.E.B. Du Bois, of course, and many others spent time in Europe where they understood better their own national situations, as well as they escaped segregation, Jim Crow laws, and disenfranchisement. They made prominent activists and intellectuals of African or Caribbean descent. This is when the very concept of diaspora took roots, referring to persons of African descent which invented, reinvented, imagined, dreamt of a connection, whatever it could be, with Africa, and sometimes chose to return or to travel to Africa. When I say return, I don't mean the physical trip and settlement in Africa. I mean a more often a symbolic form of return, a way to connect one's identity and fate to the continent. The Black Atlantic, to quote Paul Gilroy, was a loose artistic and intellectual community discussing and comparing their national and colonial situations. Colonial rule, segregation, disenfranchisement were issues of the time, but African history was also discussed and reflected upon. The influence of Marxism should also be noted. Hughes, McKay were fellow travelers of the Communist Party, as well as on the French side, Lamine Senghor, Garan Kouyaté, and on the Caribbean side, George Padmore, and later Aimé Césaire and many others. When writing on imperialism, Lenin refers to the stolen good, les biens volés, that will have to be restituted one day. The stolen good, in Lenin's words, when in the book Imperialism, the supreme stage of capitalism, the stolen goods being the colonial empires themselves, and Lenin was also referring to Russia and to the possibility for the dismantlement of the Russian colonial empire, which did not happen, of course. So the notion, it is interesting that this notion of stolen goods can be found in various journals in the 1920s and 30s, such as Légitime Défense, La Revue du Monde Noir, and others. The colonization as a process through which hundreds of thousands of cultural artifacts were stolen is clearly underlined. I'm going to take two examples here. First, the publication by Langston Hughes in 1940 of The Big Sea, which is obviously based on his trip to Africa, his long trip to Africa in 1923. When leaving New York City on a boat to Dakar, Senegal, Hughes had an almost religious moment. The boat was steaming away from New York, and Langston Hughes was at the back of the boat, and he threw into the sea all the books he had taken with him. He wanted to get rid of, as he wrote, his American culture and be ready for what he would discover in the near future. He wrote a lot on when sailing to Africa and once on the continent. Hughes never directly speaks of the restitution of African artwork, but he questions the forms of cultural domination in the colonial world and asks why so many African artwork can be found in Europe and in the United States. That is why I wholeheartedly agree with a few persons this morning who spoke of the US as that have to be included in the discussion on restitutions. For sure, we often forget that. He mentions the US. He also, Langston Hughes was also connected to philanthropist Charlotte Mason, who partly financed his work in the 1920s and 1930s. And she wanted to create a Harlem Museum of African Art. There are interesting papers on the creation that eventually failed, of such a museum in Harlem. Another example is that of the Nardal sisters, the French Martiniquais born in Martinique sisters, Jeanne and Paulette Nardal, who are now seen as the co-founders or the precursors of the Negritude movement. Paulette Nardal writes in 1936 about the creation of the Institut Français d'Afrique Noire, the French Institute of Black Africa in Dakar, and she states that with the IFAN, this institute, African artwork can be presented to the public, but she does not directly refer to restitution. In the same line, Alexandre Adandé, who helped collect artwork for the IFAN in 1936, traveled throughout Western Africa to buy objects. Some stayed in Dakar, others were sent to Paris and never sent back. Adandé writes a few years later in Présence Africaine, people come to the IFAN thinking of a real museum and they are disappointed. He describes the IFAN when it opened as a warehouse, not a real museum. So my argument here is that the notion of stolen goods was the first step towards restitution. The one missing element, obviously, is decolonization and independence. No restitution in some ways without independence. That is the challenge of the power relation between the imperial centers and the colonial world. The second moment is that of the post-World War II period in France. Here, the journal Présence Africaine is a great source. Présence Africaine, founded by Alioune Diop in 1947, with a prestigious editorial committee, Sartre, Ballandier, Michel Léris, and many others, published many articles throughout the late 40s and the 1950s and 60s, of course, whether on literature, history, ethnography, economy, all related to Africa and the perspective of decolonization one day. In the very first issue of Présence Africaine, you can read a paper, the title is Quelques objets d'art de la OEF by René Raymondon, followed by many others in the following years. In 1951, Alexandre Adandé, again from the IFAN, published a paper advocating for the urgent necessity to create museums in Africa. But his argument, in fact, remains rooted in colonial thinking and respected the hierarchies. He writes that next to the great European museums, there is room for regional museums in Africa. I quote him here. For the illiterate, it will be a testimony of the interest of the government for African traditions. For the évolué being Black Africans with some education, their knowledge of their original culture being very low, contemplating the mask, the beauty of a bronze head of Benin, will be a revelation and an incentive to respect the local cultures, end quote. So Adandé does call for the creation of a real museum in Dakar. Actually, he kind of compares the British colonies in Africa to the French colonies, and he states that there are so many more museums on the British side than on the French side, 45 by his own account on the British side. And he argues that the future museum, the museum he dreams of being created in Dakar, should have all the modern equipment and will attract many visitors. But he remains silent on the collections of the museum. We can guess that according to him, this collection should be based on the existing collection of the IFAN, as well as a policy of buying objects throughout Western Africa. In 1956, the Congress of Black Writers and Artists at the Sorbonne University, the Congrès des écrivains et artistes noirs, organized by Alioune Diop, again, was another opportunity to discuss the issue. In his speech, Aimé Césaire calls for the creation of a new civilization which is impossible to make a reality, as he says, under colonialism. He says that the cultural situation in colonial areas is, I quote him, tragic, because few things have grown on the ruins of African original cultures. In a way which can be seen as a little condescending, he speaks of marginal colonial subcultures that mimic the European cultures. What should we, he asks, as black men do? Well, he calls for the creation of a new modern African culture rooted in the past, I quote him, which can be interpreted as a way to make available the African heritage to what will be the independent nations of the African continent. However, Césaire remains a little vague on the concrete ways to preserve the past and the European collections of African artwork. His discourse on colonialism is also a powerful reflection of the essential violence of colonialism and its consequences, including the cultural and symbolic forms of violence. The third step I want to stress is, of course, that of the 1960s. And here I want to insist on two elements. First, the importance of the UNESCO before Amadou Mbow. Of course, the Organization of African Unity's 1969 Cultural Charter for Africa, with which Felwine, Sarr, and Bénédicte Savoy opened their report, should not be underestimated. It is very important. However, the UNESCO archives have a series of meetings sponsored by the UNESCO in Lagos, Ibadan, Dakar, and Brazzaville between 1960 and 1964, and the proceedings, I think, should closely be studied. There's meetings focused on African museums, folklore, cultural studies, tangible and intangible property, and even model laws for copyright. Participants in these meetings in Dakar and Lagos, maybe in Brazzaville, but I haven't found the whole proceedings for Brazzaville, stressed the need to ask for the objects being held in European museums. So participants in African cultural patrimony debates in the 1960s often oscillated between support for national and Pan-African models of cultural sovereignty, which had serious implications for the kind of laws, research projects, and cultural policies they supported. This, in parallel, had echoes in Présence africaine, where you can find several articles on restitutions. The word restitutions was printed in 1962, at a time, in fact, coincidentally, but not coincidentally for sure, when reparations for slavery came also to be discussed. I'm thinking here of the invitation made by the FEANF, the French Federation of Students from Black Africa, which was a powerful association, sometimes trade unions of African students in France, close to the French Communist Party, but not linked to it, kind of intellectual, ideological proximity. And the FEANF invited Malcolm X to come to Paris in November of 1964, a few months before Malcolm X was assassinated not far from here, of course, in New York City. Malcolm X delivered a speech at the Mutualité, this large building in the 5th arrondissement, where he speaks of two things. First, Malcolm X speaks of reparations for slavery. He argues that the centuries of slavery should make the descendants of slaves be vocal in the need to ask for some form of reparation, but he also alludes to the issue of restitution when asked by an African student. Obviously, it's not clear if he is a student, but obviously he was a person, an African person or a French person of African origin, when asked about restitutions, and he refers to that, and I suspect that he came back to this issue in his meetings and speeches at the Oxford Union the following week. So what I'm wondering is about the connection, if there is a connection at all, between the UNESCO on one side and the meetings I referred to in the early 1960s, and this active life of associations in Paris with the FEANF, also with Présence Africaine. There are ties one with another, in connection also with what would later be the Black Power movement in the United States in the years following, of course, the assassination of Malcolm X. So my purpose here is really, and this is what I want to stress in conclusion, is to stress the need for a proto-history of the restitution debate, which spans from the 1920s to the 1960s. This requires to look at the archives of civil societies, and more specifically, the immense production of ideas, projects, creative work performed by persons of African descent around the Atlantic Ocean. This political, cultural, and intellectual production is, I think, one of the main origins of the necessity for restitution as it crystallized in the 1970s. In the recent years, the CRAN, an association of black activists in France, actively promoted the need for restitution in parallel to reparations for slavery. I'm always impressed these days when talking to French persons of African descent, to realize how the restitution of African objects matters to them. It is all the more important that we cannot fully trust French public authorities when time comes to carry out the decision made by Emmanuel Macron a year ago and broaden the scope of the restitution. There is still a lot to do when it comes to make restitution a reality and not what I would call a token restitution. In this respect, I think that the mobilization of civil society does matter, and history suggests that this mobilization has taken place since the 1920s. Thank you.
Welcome back. This is the last panel for our wonderful day of reflection around the report, the Sarr and Savoy report, as it is known now. So it is my pleasure to invite Daouda Keita to come to the floor. Daouda Keita is the director of the Musée National du Mali, Bamako. It's a pleasure to have him here. Dr. Keita teaches in the Faculty of History and Geography at the University of Social Sciences and Management in Bamako. He has his PhD in prehistory from the University of Paris, West Nanterre La Défense, and he has conducted archaeological research in the Niger interior delta, in Dogon country, in Gourma province, in the Manding, in Timbuktu, and in Ségou. It is very important for us, especially West Africans, to have Daouda Keita here, because the Manding, the empire of Sundiata Keita, is definitely the cultural matrix of our region. So, Daouda.
Merci beaucoup. Avant de commencer mon propos, je tiens à remercier ceux qui ont eu cette idée générale de nous inviter à participer à ce symposium. Donc je suis là aujourd'hui pour partager notre expérience en la matière et aussi présenter des études de cas. Donc sans plus tarder, je vais commencer. C'est pourquoi nous avons intitulé notre propos « Réapproprions-nous nos biens culturels méconnus ». Et donc pour travailler sur ce sujet, nous avons élaboré un plan en 4 parties. La première partie qui va parler de la restitution des biens culturels. Ensuite, ces biens culturels constituent-ils des objets d'art? Et aussi, on va parler d'une expérience que nous avons vécue entre Maliens et Allemands. Et finalement, nous allons essayer de parler du Mali. Qu'est-ce que nous faisons maintenant au Mali? Et ensuite, il y aura une partie débat. Donc, sans plus tarder, donc, la question de la restitution des biens culturels africains a été relancée après l'allocution prononcée le 28 novembre 2017 à l'Université de Ouaga, un professeur Joseph Kizerbo, à Ouagadougou, par le président de la République française. Cette volonté affichée par le président Emmanuel Macron marque un tournant décisif dans la résolution de cette question épineuse et constitue une rupture par rapport à l'attitude jusque-là ambivalente observée par les musées européens. Le processus de la restitution semblait donc enclenché malgré de multiples interrogations, notamment celles relatives à la conservation et à l'usage qui seront faits de ces objets. La disponibilité d'infrastructures adéquates susceptibles de les recevoir, les conserver et les montrer reste également une préoccupation. Donc, cette question cherche à déterminer notre relation à l'objet exposé ou entreposé au musée. Elle est essentielle pour caractériser notre regard sur l'objet. Notre position face à un tel objet peut être à la fois multiforme et multidimensionnelle, mais elle reste déterminante pour se prononcer sur les critères de nos choix. Il est évident que la perception de l'objet ethnographique africain du visiteur européen ou même de toute personne étrangère sera orientée d'abord vers sa matérialité, son style ou son esthétique. Par contre, la fonction d'utilisation de l'objet dans son contexte de production et de pratiques immatérielles associées ne sont pas toujours perceptibles. Les objets conservés dans les musées européens sont des éléments importants du patrimoine culturel hérité de nos sociétés traditionnelles en voie de disparition. Ces objets étaient surtout fonctionnels, cultuels, rituels, utilitaires ou de réjouissance. Ils répondaient aux besoins de la société, traduisaient le savoir, le savoir-faire et le savoir-être et symbolisaient les relations de l'homme avec sa société et son environnement. Ces objets à forte charge symbolique, historique et culturelle ne sont pas à vendre ni à acheter, car on devient méconnaissable en rasant la coiffure avec laquelle on est connu. Nous avons au Mali une initiative qui mérite d'être connue. Elle est l'œuvre d'une étudiante autrichienne inscrite en thèse à l'Université d'Hambourg, Allemagne, qui mène des recherches sur des objets ethnographiques collectés par Léo Frobenius lors de son passage au Soudan français, actuelle République du Mali. En effet, il séjourna avec son équipe en Afrique de l'Ouest de 1907 à 1909. Il visita les colonies du Haut-Sénégal et le Niger. Sa collection d'objets ethnographiques se trouve entreposée dans les musées de Leipzig, de Hambourg et de Berger. La doctorante travaille sur les objets bambouillants de la collection d'Hambourg. Ainsi, 155 objets provenant de l'actuelle République du Mali ont été inventoriés. Un dossier composé d'images ainsi que des informations sur chaque objet a été remis au personnel du Musée national du Mali qui travaille à l'identification de ces objets afin de déterminer leur provenance et leur fonction. L'examen des images a permis d'identifier des instruments de musique, des objets rituels de culte, des objets personnels, des instruments de musique, des outils de mouture, de tissage et de parure. La doctorante a également séjourné à Bamako, où, en plus du personnel du Musée national, elle a eu des séances de travail avec de nombreuses personnes et ressources susceptibles de fournir des informations supplémentaires à la connaissance de ces biens culturels. Donc, à cela s'ajoute la volonté affichée de l'Institut Frobenius d'organiser une exposition dédiée au passage de Frobenius au Mali. Ce cadre de collaboration mutuellement avantageuse permet de consolider les relations entre les institutions, raffermir la confiance et dynamiser le partenariat. Cette démarche par le bas, à travers lequel les institutions de recherche se focalisent essentiellement sur le volet études donc elle donne une nouvelle dimension à la question de la restitution. Les enquêtes sur le terrain permettent de recueillir une documentation conséquente permettant d'appréhender les différentes facettes des biens culturels. La restitution des biens culturels est une pratique connue au Mali. En 1998, l'ancien président de la République française, Jacques Chirac, a restitué sous forme de don au Musée national du Mali une statuette zoomorphe représentant un bélier. Cette statuette en terre cuite, baptisée le bélier du président, offerte par le président de l'Élysée, Jacques Chirac, pour son 64e anniversaire, provenait du pillage du site archéologique de Natamatao dans le delta intérieur du Niger. Le second acte de restitution concerne un couple de statuettes anthropomorphes en bois disparues du sanctuaire où il était gardé depuis des siècles à Neni, un village dogon. Grâce aux efforts conjugués de Michel Brandt, journaliste belge, de l'Office central de lutte contre le trafic des biens culturels et de la volonté des autorités maliennes, ces statuettes proposées à la vente ont été retrouvées dans une galerie parisienne et remises à la communauté de Neni. Elles ont été sacralisées avant de regagner le sanctuaire. Donc ici, dans ce slide, je présente un peu les musées avec lesquels nous avons des collaborations de près. Donc vous avez ainsi le Bloc Museum, vous avez le musée de Volkenkunde aux Pays-Bas, le musée du Quai Branly, le musée des civilisations à Dakar, le musée de la Rotonde, le musée Moussokunda au Mali, le musée du district à Bamako et le musée régional. On vient au musée pour voir, apprendre et comprendre. C'est là également où on essaie de maintenir les liens entre l'homme et sa culture. Le Musée national du Mali possède une collection de plus de 7000 objets couvrant les domaines de la préhistoire, l'archéologie, l'histoire, l'art, l'ethnologie et les traditions populaires. Le fonds audiovisuel est composé de plus de 25 000 photographies et plus de 500 films, enregistrements sonores et vidéos. Le musée dispose d'une salle d'exposition permanente de 1700 m² et d'une salle d'exposition temporaire de 700 m². En plus des réserves archéologiques, ethnographiques et textiles, les travaux de réhabilitation entamés depuis 3 ans ont permis d'accroître la capacité d'accueil du musée national grâce à 3 nouvelles réserves. Signalons également les investigations du Musée national du Mali dans le traitement par la méthode traditionnelle de sa collection. Elle visait à mettre au point des techniques et des produits susceptibles d'être utilisés dans le cadre de la conservation des collections du musée. La plupart des objets dans la collection actuelle du musée ont certainement subi des traitements par des méthodes traditionnelles avant leur acquisition. Ce constat a conduit les chercheurs à procéder à l'inventaire des méthodes utilisées traditionnellement avant de procéder à leur expérimentation et tester leur efficacité. des expériences concluantes ont été réalisées sur le cuir d'origine organique et les métaux bronze, cuivre et fer d'origine minérale. Les activités du Musée national s'articulent autour des expositions, des activités culturelles. Il propose aux visiteurs 3 expositions dans la salle d'exposition permanente. La première, le Mali millénaire, met l'accent sur l'archéologie comme une source essentielle pour la reconstitution de l'histoire du Mali. Elle évoque aussi les méfaits du pillage des sites archéologiques et les objets exhumés frauduleusement alimentent malheureusement le trafic illicite des biens culturels. Le second est intitulé « Chefs-d'œuvre d'art et rituel », présente l'organisation sociale et religieuse des sociétés traditionnelles dans lesquelles l'initiation et les pratiques rituelles occupaient une place importante. Elles sont à l'origine de la production des sculptures en bois, masques, statuettes, aujourd'hui qualifiées d'objets d'art. Ces objets désacralisés sont les témoins de l'ingéniosité des artisans et des pratiques ancestrales. La dernière traite de l'histoire du tissage et de la teinture au Mali. Elle montre la diversité des traditions textiles maliennes reconnaissables par les techniques, les motifs et les traditions vestimentaires. Le coton et la laine étaient les matières premières utilisées dans la confection des pagnes, couvertures, boubous. La teinture à l'indigo ou à l'argile est traditionnellement utilisée par les femmes. 2 à 3 expositions annuelles sont organisées dans la salle d'exposition temporaire. Les plus récentes sont les signes Borolan, poèmes de l'artiste Tidiane Ndongo, musique du Mali d'hier pour aujourd'hui, artistes et instruments en récréation, organisés à partir des collections du Musée national en juillet 2019. Nous travaillons actuellement sur une exposition intitulée « À la frontière de l'artisanat et de l'art, les œuvres de Mairie Sangaré ». Le Musée national initie également des activités culturelles à l'intention du public scolaire et non scolaire. Ces activités s'articulent autour des manifestations récréatives appelées jeudis musicaux, les contes du Mali, la projection de films, les ateliers et activités scolaires. Le Musée national subit depuis 2012 la plus grave crise que le Mali ait connue depuis son indépendance, plongeant ainsi le pays dans une crise sociale, institutionnelle, sécuritaire, économique sans précédent. Le patrimoine culturel a été fortement endommagé. Ainsi, vous voyez là-bas, les mausolées de Tombouctou ont été détruits et les images ont fait le tour du monde. Ainsi, sur 16 musées, 14 ont été complètement saccagés. Et en bas, vous voyez aussi les manuscrits du centre Ahmed Baba ont aussi subi des dégâts et environ 370 000 ont été déplacés sur Bamako pour les sauvegarder. Donc, depuis la crise, les visiteurs du musée se font rares. Donc, vous voyez en bas les statistiques de la fréquentation du musée. Et on voit que depuis 2012, la courbe a fondu carrément. Et en haut, c'est les statistiques de la fréquentation touristique des hôtels du Mali. Là aussi, on voit qu'à partir de 2012, il y a eu une chute considérable et les touristes ne commençaient plus à venir au Mali. Donc, cette crise est à la base de l'inscription des sites de Tombouctou en 2012, Gao en 2012, Djenné en 2016 sur la liste du patrimoine mondial en péril. Et cette crise aussi, durant cette crise, le musée municipal de Tombouctou a été saccagé. Le musée du Sahel de Gao a été occupé par les djihadistes. Les djihadistes avaient même instauré dans les régions du Nord l'interdiction de toutes les activités culturelles. Dans les régions du centre, on a assisté au saccage du Toguna de la ville de Douenza, la destruction des sites Toloy de Sanga, pays d'Ogon. La crise a aussi conduit à la suspension de toutes les formes de collaboration bilatérale en matière de recherche et notamment dans le cadre du patrimoine culturel, entraînant du coup le pillage de nombreux sites archéologiques et la vente illicite de nombreux biens culturels. Donc pour pallier à cette situation, il est essentiel de proposer des solutions permettant la relance des activités dans nos musées et par la même occasion tenter de résorber l'absence de touristes étrangers. Le retour des biens culturels peut alors servir de cadre de mobilisation des communautés autour de leur patrimoine. Les musées, lieux de conservation et d'exposition de ce patrimoine jusque-là inconnu, seront des espaces ouverts au service de toute la communauté. Ces initiatives qui permettent de rapprocher le musée de son public demeurent les seules possibles à rendre nos musées vivants. Le retour des biens culturels ne sera bénéfique que si les objets seront accessibles aux différentes communautés. Et pour cela, des expositions itinérantes ou temporaires seront organisées dans les musées régionaux ou communautaires. Ainsi, les manifestations culturelles organisées par les communautés autour de ces biens culturels les amèneront progressivement à s'approprier ces biens et les musées. Donc pour terminer, le processus des biens culturels africains ne sera réellement effectif que lorsque les partenaires travailleront ensemble à l'élaboration d'un programme qui tienne compte des spécificités de chaque pays. Il doit en outre fournir des informations complètes sur chaque objet et surtout permettre l'accès l'accès aux réserves des musées français où sont conservés ces biens culturels. La restitution des biens culturels doit également obéir au principe suivant: ramener le bien culturel là où il a été pris. Donc c'est ainsi que nous posons une question sur les biens de l'âge Omar et de son fils qui, semble-t-il, sont aujourd'hui, qui ont été pris à Ségou en 1880 et que ces biens-là sont conservés aujourd'hui au Sénégal. Cette démarche soulève aussi une autre question, celle relative au butin de guerre des figures historiques transfrontalières. Nous pensons que nulle autorité ne saurait résoudre cette question. Elle passe nécessairement par une rencontre régionale des pays concernés pour discuter de la problématique de restitution du patrimoine africain, conformément à la déclaration politique et à la position commune de la communauté économique des États de l'Afrique de l'Ouest sur le retour des biens culturels en Afrique. Je vous remercie.
Merci infiniment, Daouda. Now I would like to invite Marie-Cécile Zinsou. Let me just say that Marie-Cécile Zinsou is one of the most prominent cultural actors in Africa and indeed in the world. She created, and she's the president of the foundation Zinsou that she founded in June 2005 in Benin. And after just 15 years, the Zinsou Foundation has been hosting 32 exhibitions and has received 6 million visitors to its 6 libraries, exhibition space, and museum. This is a response to the question that was raised earlier about the people visiting museum in Africa, and the action of Marie-Cécile is really living evidence that once people recognize themselves in whatever they have, they will be just coming as crowds into those museums. Let me just add while she comes here that Marie-Cécile is a member of the board of the Château de Versailles, the Paris Institute of Islamic Culture in Paris, and the Maison Maria Casares. And the Zinsou Foundation has been widely recognized as it received, for example, a grant for young artists from the Japanese Premium Imperial in 2014. So, Marie-Cécile, thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor, and thank you very much, Zoe Strotter, for inviting me. I'm sorry, I'm very impressed because it's a very important academic panel, and as the professor just said, I did my study and my job, I invented both when I created my museum when I was 21, so I always feel a bit frightened when I'm in such an important academic panel. I'm here to give you kind of a testimony, maybe a bit of personal testimony on restitution. So I'm maybe going to start with one story. The story of a man called Bernardino Ayai Durand. This man was in the second part of the 19th century, a person who had been educated by Catholic missionaries in Ouida, in Dahomey. Dahomey is the name of Benin, where I come from. This person, having been educated, could read and could count, and he became quite quickly a commercial agent in a French trade house, the Régis House, which is an important French trade house in Ouida. When, in 1890, when the colonial army arrived in Benin, in Dahomey, they were looking for somebody who could translate between French and Dahomeans. So they thought about this agent in the French trade house, and they came to see him, and he became the interpreter between the Dodds general, the person who led the colonial war, and the king of Abomey, Béhanzin, who was our last king and who was deported in 1894. The last Dahomean person who bowed to the king and who said goodbye from the Dahomean people was this person, Bernardino Ayai Durand. And he was the one who saw the artifacts from the royal court of Abomey leave with the boat to France. This is the first story. It connects after with the second one. The second one is in 2006, the Musée of the Quai Branly was created in France, and it's the museum where you find most of the African French heritage. The French president at that time, the President Ciraj, thought the Quai Branly existed only if it was a culture dialogue and if that really meant something, and that it was not just a sentence under the name of the museum. So he asked the curators and the president of the museum to send the Dahomean artifacts to Benin. It was the first time Quai Branly was going to send an important part of the Dahomean collection to Benin, and in general, African collections to Africa. They were looking for a museum who could receive the works. At that time, you must remember 2006, we didn't really have social media. YouTube was born 3 months before. So it was very beginning, and all the critics and people talking about how Africa cannot care about its heritage. You had a few articles, but nothing like what we heard when the report, when Bénédicte and Felwine's report went out, because people couldn't express so much so freely and to everyone. So people were very frightened. People in the Quai Branly were very frightened that the objects should come back in Western Africa. They came to me, and I opened my museum 1 year before, and they thought it looked quite professional and quite serious. So they said, maybe you can present the collections, and maybe you could do something, because you seem to say that people are coming to the museum and that something is happening there. So on the 16th of December, we opened an exhibition with 34 pieces of the Royal Abomey Court, which were shown for the first time. Last time the artifacts were in Benin, it was in 1892, with this Bernardino Ayai Durand saying goodbye to the object, and a few years later saying goodbye to the king. The reason I told you about the Bernardino Ayai Durand is very simple. His daughter is named Dominga, and maybe I should have introduced myself saying I'm not only Marie-Cécile Zinsou. I'm Marie-Cécile Dominga Zinsou. I'm named after his daughter because this person is my great-great-grandfather. So that's why it is, I discovered it, I must admit, I discovered it on the 16th of December 2006 when my grandfather told me it's really moving because you're the one receiving the objects for the first time, but it's my great-grandfather who saw them leave. And so that's why it's such a personal story at first, because I had the immense chance to show our heritage for the first time since 120 years. And yeah, it was a link, it was a family link, a very strong family link, thinking we were at the two sides of the, in France we would say two sides of the chain. I'm not sure you can say that in English, but I guess you understood. So we opened the exhibition and it lasted for 3 months. We closed in March. After 3 months, we received 275,000 persons who came and discovered their heritage for the first time. We worked with everyone. We worked with associations, we worked with schools, we worked with all possible people who wanted to work with us on this story. We were quite amazed by the fact that people were willing to discover their history so much, because obviously what you hear is that Africa, people don't go to museums in Africa. You hear that. One thing nobody says is that there are no museums. So that's why people don't go to museums in Africa. You can't find museums. And when you open a museum, when you bring their heritage, when you explain the story, when you open the doors, then you realize how much people want to come, how much people want to discover the story, reconnect with their history, and that what you can think, like, people just don't go, it's not they don't go, it's we have National Museum in a very poor state, very far away from anything, and quite expensive. It's $2, but I mean, the average salary is $50. So you can't really go with your 5 children to the museum. It's not realistic. So we try to show that when you give a real chance to people to connect with their history, it works. In 2006, we couldn't ask the restitution. To be perfectly honest, the Museum of the Quai Branly said, you know, you should ask, as a country, you should ask for a long-time loan, because we could lend the objects for 30 years, and probably in 30 years nobody would ask them. So you could keep them for quite a long time. And at that time, I tried to ask the government to take consideration in that proposition, but it didn't work. People were not very interested. People told me, you can keep them, but you know, I had a foundation, it was one exhibition, I have a contemporary art foundation for living artists, trying to work on the fact that we show now our artists, we create a collection like this in 200 years, we won't have to ask people in the US and in Europe if they can send back the heritage of the beginning of 21st century. So I couldn't keep forever the artifacts. But at that time, restitution was not possible in the Beninese mine, and it was not possible in the French mine, because the French law is made as such that there is an inalienability, no, I can't say it, sorry. I'll format it. The French law doesn't permit artworks to be withdrawn from national heritage. So it was not possible to think about restitution. It was possible to think an exhibition. The Quai Branly said, okay, it was a success, maybe we're going to make some others. Finally, the Bamako Museum received a few objects, but there was never any big exhibition of the Quai Branly on the continent. So the Bamako Museum and the Zinsou Foundation were only 2 museums to be able to say today that we had correspondence with the Quai Branly. And so what really changed in 2017 is that the new French president said Africa must get its heritage back. And what was very different is that it had just been elected. He kind of knew Africa better than the other one, because he had not lived there, but he had spent like 8 months in Nigeria, so he had a different experience of Africa. And the National Assembly was controlled by him. So obviously when he said, you will get it back, he can make it possible. We can believe it. For the first time, we can believe something is really possible because he might be able to change the law. Today, the law hasn't been changed, but is there still 3 years? So we're gonna trust him with his promise and hope it's gonna change. But it created great expectations in Africa. And that's from maybe the European point of view, but then we have to see that restitution debate in Benin has created major changes. First, we've spoken a lot about it with Bénédicte. First, it's the real change is social media. Today, social media is the place where you can discuss and debate about restitution. Everyone can speak about it. On my Facebook page and on my Twitter page, a lot of people from everywhere in the West African region comment, ask, they have a lot of questions, they want to know what's happening, they read about it, they see the articles, they give their opinion. So today it's very important because it's a popular subject. People speak about it on social media, but then from social media to the street, people speak about it and have plenty of ideas about it. So it's the first time that you can really feel that heritage is the center of the discussion. It's not just something that you read in the newspaper or that you hear from France. It's something that happens in Benin and in countries around. So this is the first thing. Then it's putting back, the restitution debate is putting back the question of our heritage and culture in the center of the public debate. And culture has not been the priority since the 60s. We've been independent in the 60s, in 1960. We had emergencies. We are very, very young countries. We had emergencies when colonization stopped. Most people think colonization brought us everything, but actually we had no school, we had no hospitals, we had no infrastructure, so we had to build everything. And museums were not priority, so we got used to the absence of museum and the absence of culture as a major subject. So restitution debate is putting back culture in the middle of our conversation and of our identity. And then about colonization, you have to see that colonization is very special because it erased a part of our history. It's something that it's maybe difficult to feel from elsewhere than Western Africa, but colonization has created cliches that are so important in the society today that even African people, even Beninese people, believe in those cliches. And the restitution debate, having our heritage back, is the base to build our version of history. Because today we have a very big problem. The school programs haven't really evolved since colonization. This morning, where we were speaking, I asked to my Instagram and Twitter followers if they felt they knew their history. In Benin, do you feel you know where you come from? 80% of them say, no, absolutely not. We've heard a little about it when we were in like 6th grade in school, but that's it. They know about Napoleon. They know about Louis XIV, Louis XIV. They know very well about French history. Sometimes they even know things that in France people don't know. But they don't know anything about Benin. And when I said, okay, where could you learn your history? Are you going to museums? So some of them said, obviously they came to my museums, which was nice because it's always flattering. But the truth is people were saying, well, we could find it in books. We don't really have books about it, but we could find it in books. Or maybe we can find it on social media, or maybe you could do stories about it on Instagram. So the new challenge is how do you present your history and your heritage on Instagram in a 3-second image that disappears after one day. So this is probably the next big challenge. But this is yeah, 80% of young people saying we don't know our history is a problem. Because after you have Africans don't preserve their heritage, which is the thing that everybody, you can hear everywhere. They don't create museums. Museums are not African. And all those things, you hear them. Oh, and the worst one that I have to tell you is when an old man dies, a library is burning. This is probably the worst, because this, you hear it everywhere in Benin, and young people always tell me that. Oh, he died, it's like a library burning. No, it just died. It's not nothing about books. It's, but this might seem fun, but it's not, because it's just this idea of colonization who taught us that we had no history, because we only had an oral history. So as we only speak, words disappear, and our history has disappeared. Which is very difficult to believe when you can imagine that in Timbuktu in the 14th century, there was one of the most important universities in the world. It's difficult to imagine that after we decided to stop all our research and start to speak and speak and speak and die and that's it. This is a very big problem today. All those things you hear and people repeat and people interiorize is that, I mean, we're a developing country. We face major challenges. People that were born now, while we're speaking in Benin, they will need to be the same person as the person who were born now in New York. I mean, they will be asked the same thing, because we're in a connected world, so you can't feel that geography still exists. Geography doesn't exist. So those people born in Benin, they need exactly the same background as everyone, and they need to know where they come from. And so that's one of the big problems with colonization and restitution debates, and hopefully artifacts coming back is very important, because people are going to be able to face history. It's not things that they're being told by other people. It's their history standing just there. You can see it, you can learn from it, you can face it, and once you face it, you can also put it on the side and invent your future. And that's why restitution is so important for us today, because we need to connect with who we are, and today it's very difficult. Today we've been shocked by slavery, colonization, and on top of that we had a little Marxist-Leninism at the end of the 70s, 80s. So after that, who are we? Restitution is not just a question of fighting France for this injustice, having our heritage 5,000 kilometers away. Restitution today is a question of getting our identity back and trying to understand who we are. So we've heard a lot of things, and one of the things was about the museums, having no museums. In Dahomey, I'm not going to pretend we had museums. The one who was created in 1926, I think, so it's a colonial museum. But everyone in the Dahomey saw the heritage every year. Because maybe we didn't invent the museum because we didn't ask people to come to see the heritage. Every year, the heritage from Dahomey went to see the people, which is something that has been invented in Western Africa, and that is questioning the way we create museums today. You were speaking about it just before, like how can we create new museums when in the 21st century? Maybe we can find inspirations in 18th century Dahomey. The parade of wealth every year was this moment when all the population came to Abomey, the capital of the kingdom, and everybody would gather together, and the most important artifacts from the royal court would get out and be shown to everyone. And that was following the night before, because the night before people were told the history of the kingdom. There was a versified poem telling the story of the 12 kings to all the population. So we had general history lesson, and then we had public demonstration of national collections, which was quite modern in the 18th century. And that explains also that maybe we can't preserve our heritage. Maybe today it's not possible in 21st century. Maybe we don't know how to do. But when the colonial army entered Abomey in 1892, they found artifacts from 17th and 18th century and 19th century. So obviously it's very difficult to think that we couldn't do today what we used to do 2 centuries ago, and that we had no problem dealing with. So all those things is going back to the new generation. Restitution today, the question is in Benin, we have to create museums and it's very important, we have to keep the objects. I don't think we create museums to keep the objects. I don't think we create places for old artworks to stay. I think we create places, museums, for the young generation and for the next generation, which is a very different point of view. It's not for the objects, it's for the people. And that is something we're trying to do right now. Our government still pretends it's doing it, so we are still believing it's doing it. But today, fighting for the restitution, because it's a fight, I think Bénédicte and Felwine will be able to tell us how much it's a fight. Fighting for restitution today is not really an engagement for artifacts. It's a struggle against the colonial state of mind you can still find in Europe and in a lot of countries looking at Africa. It's also a battle for young Beninese who need to know where they come from in order to know where they're going to. That's it.
Thank you so much, Marie-Cécile. Last but certainly not least, the speaker now will be our own Zoe Strutter, Ridgio Professor of African Art at Columbia University. And Zoe has really made this place, Columbia University, one of the center of African art history here in New York and in the US. And it is always a pleasure to work with her and to be invited to the committees of dissertation of the many students she trains in the knowledge of African art. So Zoe, last word would be yours.
No, not the last word, but thank you. Okay, in 1997, Enid Schildkraut, then curator of the African collections at the American Museum of Natural History, delivered a paper at the International Council of Museums meeting on the protection of African heritage, asking, does Africa have anything to learn from NAGPRA? She was referring to the Native American Graves Protection Act, nicknamed NAGPRA, which was signed into US law in 1990. This many years later, I would like to take up the question again of NAGPRA. In particular, the precedents it set for repatriation programs engaging religious practitioners or the descendants of the original owners of the objects in question. When I looked into it, I found that there were not as many studies published as one might have wished. The following is based on a series of 1 to 2 hour interviews with repatriation officers having 10 to 15 years experience at a series of major collections. Now, at its most basic, NAGPRA requires institutions receiving federal funding to inventory their collections and to inform Indian tribes and Native Hawaiian and Native Alaskan organizations of objects or collections that might be eligible for repatriation. And in the NAGPRA world, the term repatriation is used because restitution for Native Americans refers to the transfer of land and resources. So as summarized by Nell Murphy, NAGPRA affords tribes the right to repatriate 5 types of Native American collections, human remains, associated and unassociated funerary objects, cultural patrimony, and sacred items when certain criteria are met. Now, NAGPRA was spearheaded by Native Americans, And its goal was to empower Native Americans and to help protect and rejuvenate Native American religious and ethnic identities. This focus on religion shaped NACPRA. The most direct impact was that groups could make claims to repatriate individuals for the purpose of reburial. They could claim funerary objects also for the purpose of reburial. The claims for sacred or patrimonial objects were more complex. The claimants have to show that the object was needed for ongoing religious practices, that's what I underlined, needed for the practice of traditional Native American religions by their present-day adherents, or that the object was of inestimable cultural importance to the culture. The battle over NACPRA brought to light a shameful history of grave robbing and oppression. The discovery of the remains of approximately 200,000, I repeat, 200,000 Native American individuals in American institutions galvanized Native American students and activists. Personally, it was shocking for me to learn in working on this paper that even Franz Boas, Columbia's hero, Franz Boas, the passionate advocate for cultural relativity, financed his fieldwork on the Northwest Coast through museum commerce and human remains. He wrote, "It is most unpleasant work to steal bones from a grave, but someone has to do it." And he sold over 100 complete skeletons and 200 crania to the Smithsonian and made sizable collections available for sale to Berlin and the Field Museum in Chicago. Now, like President Macron, NACPRA set a 5-year deadline, in this case for the publication of item-by-item inventories of human remains and funerary objects. An interviewee told me that the lawyers and accountants in the museums were impatient with the process. It's the law, this is costing us money, let's get it done, let's move on. But despite the pressure, few institutions were able to meet the deadline because, as many people in this room know, museum records were abbreviated, the vocabulary unique to each institution and full of guesses that needed to be verified. A collection such as AM&H required an extension of 10 years to publish improved but far from complete inventories. In the 2000s, websites have emerged as wonderful tools for transparency. The Smithsonian Museum of Natural History posts all claims on their website along with the results. In this case, for example, it reports a claim for 9 cultural objects by an Apache community and gives the history of acquisition. And I chose this one because there was some denial. The Smithsonian recommended that the cradles petition be returned because they were removed from grave sites. On the other hand, they rejected another claim for lack of evidence that it belonged to a particular Western Apache tribe. And as an aside, many Native Americans have chosen to retain the word tribe, which is now rejected by most Africanists. In a third case, the Smithsonian judged the caps requested to have been personal property that was legitimately sold and purchased. These claims can always be reopened at any time with the presentation of new evidence, but saying no is not popular, and everyone I talked to dreaded it for fear of what might happen on social media. Museums are also required to invite authorized tribal representatives to consult about their collections. And this has been an expensive procedure, but what people seem to like best about the legislation. Institutions often accept the claims presented, and the collaboration can lead to the creation of new knowledge and relationships. In 1999, a delegation of 13 Tlingit left their home in Angoon, Alaska, to pay a 2-week visit to examine the objects listed by AM&H as eligible for repatriation. In order to get to the Tlingit collection, one of their group, Harold Jacobs, walked down an aisle in the storeroom and spotted a red beaver carved to ornament the prow of a canoe. I gasped because I knew what it was. Now, the carving had not been put on the list by AM&H for inspection because no one knew what it was. The record said only that it came from Alaska and that it was purchased in 1911 from a naval lieutenant. However, people from Yangon knew its history well. In 1882, a dispute escalated to the point where the US Navy bombarded the community, destroying everything they owned. This single canoe escaped because it was away fishing. The situation was dire because winter was approaching, and the community only survived by using this one vessel to help all the clans in Yangon hunt fish and gather fuel. Years later, when the canoe's hull cracked, the prowpiece was removed to preserve it, and the beloved canoe was cremated as a person would have been. It is an unsolved mystery what happened to the beaver after that. The museum accepted the claim for repatriation, and in October 1999, the prowpiece returned home and has since appeared in numerous potlatches. It is not just a fine carving, but relates a powerful history of survival in the face of adversity. Now, inviting Tlingit into their storerooms, as required by law, produced new knowledge about the collection and inspired new exhibition strategies. Furthermore, the objects returned has helped foster a healthy relationship with Tlingit that has survived despite the museum declining to return certain other objects. Now, when NAGPRA passed, the predictions were dire that museums would be emptied. Some archaeologists even compared it to the Nazi book burning. But 30 years later, many tens of thousands of individuals have been reburied, but not many cultural objects have changed hands. And so you can see some of the figures here. For the Natural History Museum at the Smithsonian, 19,000 individuals have been returned, but only 100 sacred objects. The National Museum of the American Indian has by far the most in the country in terms of sacred objects, several thousand, and perhaps it's relevant that their director is Native American. The inventory of funerary objects always sounds extraordinary, numbering in the thousands and thousands, because they count every bead, every piece of animal bone, every pottery shard, every item of jewelry. And about 400 cultural objects have been returned from AMNH, and that hasn't changed in the past 9 years. The Fowler at UCLA is led by a gung-ho repatriation officer determined to rid the museum of human remains and funerary objects, but she has not been able to reach her goal. They have returned about 2,000 individuals and only 14 ceremonial objects. Now, my interviewees were agreed that more often than not, no one answers when they send out their notices to the tribes. They have learned that it can be a burden to take on repatriation. Tribes have pressing economic, social, and health issues that must take priority. It's expensive for them to gather the documentation, to come to a consensus on what to do, possibly to create new rituals for burying people who should have stayed buried in the first place. It takes time and commitment to travel to museums to inspect collections, time off from work. There is also an emotional cost in dealing with a painful past. For example, sometimes handling the skulls of women and children who were clearly murdered. After 30 years, most have preferred to let the matter rest, at least for now. Some interviewees felt that it would be disrespectful to follow up or badger the tribes. Wendy Teeter at the Fowler believes strongly in following up in order to learn what the silence means. She's learned, for example, that Navajo don't even want to consider repatriating individuals unless they can be personally identified. They are also loath to take back what they call hot objects. They say that if they don't know how something was made, they won't know how to handle it carefully. In these cases, Teeter will go back yet again to ask, okay, we'll leave it here, but how should we care for it? Should other Navajo be allowed access, for example? And they have quite a number of works that anyone may see except a Navajo or except a Navajo woman of childbearing age. Teeter asked how they might want things to be described or if there should be restrictions on exhibitions or research access. One of her most surprising discoveries that many were more concerned restricting access to anthropological documents than to the objects themselves. In several cases, they requested that these records be sealed or at least kept away from women of childbearing age. Now, the idea of sealing records is galling to people arguing for the priority of science, but it is within the stated goals of some of those who wrote the NACRA legislation, who said that the most important issue was not repatriation in itself, but to empower Native Americans in the decision-making process. When asked what they would advise Africanists in thinking about repatriation, all of my interviewees, to a person, stressed the importance of listening. This was most eloquently voiced by Nell Murphy at AM&H, who said, "Be flexible, never assume that you know what a group wants, never generalize, and listen more than you talk." To cite one of many surprises, the Southern Cheyenne declined repatriation when informed of a sizable collection of funerary objects looted in the 1860s from the grave of a young girl. Bill Billick explained that the 1860s represented an apocalyptic moment in Cheyenne history when they were being pushed west by the US government. Tribal representatives were moved that their ancestors had honored the passing of one of their daughters with such love and devotion during a time of starvation and despair. They decided not to take back the funerary objects because they would be obliged to let them decay. Instead, they asked the museum to display the collection and to talk about how the Cheyenne had cherished their children. They wanted this exhibition to teach Cheyenne, other Native Americans, and the American public at large. And here in the photo, you see the director of the museum signing a curation agreement with the Cheyenne representative. In 2005, the Smithsonian Natural History Museum returned this headdress to the Tlingit killer whale clan. However, the clan representative, Edwell John Jr., was also a computer instructor in the Alaska schools, and he asked the museum if they would consider making a 3D scan of the original to keep as an archival copy. The Smithsonian was delighted to oblige. The museum then asked if they could display the copy, if other Tlingit could handle it, and the possibilities mushroomed. John was happy to see the replica dance by Tlingit in the museum and put no restrictions on it. Tlingit have checked it out and taken it to several of the balls, celebrating the inauguration of at least 2 presidents of the United States. The original has also returned to dance with its twin in the museum. The anthropologists in the museum are pleased as punch. The whole affair subverts conventional definitions of authenticity because the work has been danced by the right people. However, it isn't authentic to Tlingit because the commissioning family didn't, quote, kill money, that is, pay an affiliated clan to make it. Or is it authentic? Eric Hollinger reports that the fidelity of the copy is creating an emotional bond that defies expectations. He says, clan members feel a connection to the replica even though, in their own words, it's just a piece of wood. It's starting to build its own life and its own history in a unique way, even though it's not a clan crest object. Now, making and displaying a copy is much easier in an anthropology museum. The curator of an art museum would be pained to learn that the original has since lost 4 teeth from being danced at home in Alaska, because art museums are committed to the eternal preservation of original objects. Bill Billick, the head of the repatriation office in the museum, made an important observation when he noted that NACRA stipulates that the evaluation of a claim may not consider what will happen to the object when it returns. The question is off the table. Now, as of 2009, 1,550 institutions and nearly 600 tribes have participated in the repatriation process. And the end is not in sight. This has been a mammoth and expensive project. So Ciraj Rassool raised the question of the funds needed to support claims, and people have talked about the need for transparency in websites and inventories, et cetera. So everyone agrees with Michael Brown and Margaret Bruchac in describing NACPRA as a classic instance of an underfunded federal mandate. What underfunded signifies is that the budgeting of $39 million over a 10-year period was nowhere near enough. The rest of the costs have fallen on the institutions and on the tribes. The impact on individual institutions varies depending on the size of the relevant collections. I give a sampling here. It often involves significant redistribution of resources. For example, at the Natural History Museum in Washington, D.C., almost every new hiring position in the 1990s was directed to repatriation staff rather than to curatorial or education. And today, you can see they have 6 to 8 full-time staff. AM&H has 1.5 positions, but it needed 5 to 10 staff members over a long period. The Fowler has 2 half-time positions. The Field Museum in Chicago has 2 full-time positions. This is just for NACPRA. But as NACPRA process quiets down, the new frontier is opening in international claims for which there's no legislated rule book. And AM&H feels that the situation is spiraling out of control. On a practical level, NACPRA had the advantage that it addresses institutions operating within a single nation state. Nonetheless, it is considered a government-to-government protocol because it identifies who has the right to make a claim as the appointed representative of a federally recognized tribe or Native Hawaiian or Native Alaskan organization. In contrast, the Macron report proposes only dealing with national governments, although there are potential parallels between the tribal councils recognized by NACPRA and the chieftaincies or kingdoms established in African countries that experience indirect rule, such as Nigeria or the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I found it encouraging to learn more about NACPRA because a lot of good has come out of it. Not denying the differences, it offers a model for engaging religious practitioners as stakeholders to be consulted in the museum. Its most important lesson is asking an open questions, what is important to you, and to listen to the answers on a case-by-case basis. As Murphy said, never assume you know what a group wants. As we saw, this could be as different as we want to rebury these items, or we don't want them back because we don't want to rebury them, we want you to exhibit them, or you took it, you deal with it. Or 3, we've changed our religion and prefer to leave it with you. Or even, we want you to make a 3D scan. The possibilities are dazzling. It will change the museum, but if 30 years of experience are any guide, it won't empty them. Thank you.